Kia ora koto. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I look forward to hearing from you. The full paper has been accepted for publication in the International Journal of Learning, so you will have access to it there. The narrative presented here comes from a 3-year-long study into the development and integration of critical literacy practices in primary and secondary classrooms with a group of 17 teachers. Critical literacy pedagogy supports students to develop the practices of a text analyst. The narrative under analysis in this paper was produced from the transcript of a research team working day in which the conversations of the research team were audiotaped as they analyzed videotape lessons and proposed ways forward for their pedagogy. Please see the full paper for the complete narrative. In this paper, I conduct a reparative reading of a confessional narrative of inclusion in order to demonstrate how engaging with an ethics of care of the self might support educators to navigate the pressures they face. This paper is developed after the spirit of Foucault's ethic of discomfort, in which he urges us to, quote, never consent to being completely comfortable with one's own presuppositions, unquote. Working within an ethic of discomfort means reconciling the discomfort we feel when reading an uncomfortable narrative with the knowledge that it is valuable to engage in critical reflection as a means to improve teaching. Sedgwick compares and contrasts paranoid or critical readings with reparative readings that engender a different, quote, relational stance, unquote, in order to pay, quote, more respectful attention, unquote, to the texts and its authors. A reparative reading might support teachers to critically reflect on the narrative presented here in order to, quote, realize that the future may be different from the present, unquote. New Zealand teachers find themselves working within a policy context that contains mixed discursive messages. In the case of the education of students with special education needs, different discourses will have differing effects on how the teacher understands the student and develops programs of instruction. Within any given discursive field, quote, there can exist different and even contradictory discourses, unquote. Researchers working in the field of inclusion in New Zealand have highlighted the different and contradictory discourses underpinning the various policies that shape teachers' work. One discourse commonly circulating is that of special education. This discourse is grounded in medical models of disability in which, quote, pathologies of defectiveness, unquote, are used to justify particular educational treatments. In this view, there is a focus on the individual who is the host of the disease or disability. The effects of a discourse of special education can, quote, absolve those working with the student of any responsibility to meet their needs, unquote. Another discourse circulating in the field of education in New Zealand is that of inclusion. For the purposes of this paper, quote, inclusive education is concerned with reducing all exclusionary pressures and all devaluations of students, whether on the basis of disability, attainment, race, gender, class, family structure, lifestyle, or sexuality, unquote. In this discourse, a disability is not something found within the individual, but rather it is seen, quote, as a product of social factors in the context in which she/he participates that create barriers and limit opportunities for equal participation, unquote. A discourse of inclusion places emphasis on a process that is needed to achieve inclusion rather than the individual child that has particular needs to be addressed. In the narrative, the teacher positions the student with special education needs in binary opposition to the other students. By doing this, the teacher is claiming that she cannot serve the needs of both groups at once. Either she, quote, manages to marginalize the student in order to work with the others, unquote, or, quote, would you maybe say no, I'm not taking them out because it's too hard, unquote. This positioning forces the teacher to choose the group or the student. The teacher, by her own admission, frequently chooses the group and excludes the student, quote, I've made a bad judgment call yet again, unquote. The binary of student with special education needs versus other students follows a discourse of special education in locating the problem within the individual student. A discourse of special education can also be read as a deficit discourse, in which students with special education needs are pathologized. Commentators have drawn our attention to the ways in which the deficit theorizing of students who do not belong to majority groups continues to disadvantage and exclude large groups of students. One reading of the narrative positions the teacher as a reflective professional. Quote, how many times do I manage to marginalize him in order to work with the others, unquote, who appears to be critically reflecting on her practice and seeking input from her colleagues. During the course of the narrative, however, This positioning shifts to that of teacher as victim. Quote, "Anyway, so I just thought I'd tell you about this marginalization we have." Unquote. This positioning reinscribes a discourse of special education in which she is expected to, quote, "integrate all these children into our rooms now," unquote, or be, quote, "hauled over the coals because you haven't met this criteria," unquote. By drawing on discourses of special education to position herself as a victim, the teacher also reinforces one effect of a discourse of special education, that of doing nothing. In keeping with the teacher's positioning as victim is the mother's positioning as vigilante. A vigilante does not wait for the authorities to arrive, but rather dishes out the punishment personally. Thus, the mother as vigilante is present to determine that the teacher has, quote, "made a bad judgment call yet again," unquote. In the literature, it is not uncommon for parents to have to be advocates for their disabled child, so it would not have been surprising if the parent had been positioned as an advocate. However, the parent is positioned as a vigilante. As we have seen, the teacher's narrative draws upon the competing and contradictory discourses of special education and inclusion. Rather than viewing it as a confession, we can view it as an invitation to engage in collaborative analysis and an occasion to work within an ethic of discomfort. As her colleagues, we missed an opportunity to support her repositioning as a concerned professional who can use writing, or in this case the construction of a narrative text, quote, "to become someone other than who one is," unquote. Slee asked the provocative yet simplistic question about exclusion. What are we going to do about it? For Foucault, ethics is not about a code that one must follow. Rather, it concerns, quote, "how the individual is supposed to constitute himself as a moral subject of his own actions," unquote. To accomplish ourselves as ethical subjects, we employ what Foucault terms technologies of the self. An important aspect of technologies of the self is the role of reflection, accomplished through study, meditation, and writing. Through the use of writing as a means to care for the self, one can engage in what Foucault referred to as the practice of freedom. We can think of ourselves as free when we develop and maintain, quote, "a constant attitude," unquote, of critique towards our conduct and ourselves. As educators, this means shaping ourselves in keeping with the discourses we wish to support and in resistance to the discourses we wish to reject. I urge educators to produce texts for analysis and to think of what counts as a text quite broadly. Text can be made by capturing our practice in a personal journal, audiotaped or videotaped lessons, the gathering of other texts such as examples of curriculum planning or student work, the construction of portfolios, or even the development of an anti-curriculum vitae. In order to practice an ethic of care for the self, we need to engage in a, quote, "permanent critique of ourselves," unquote. This is not easy to accomplish alone. Foucault suggests that we work with, quote, "a guide, a counselor, a friend," unquote, to reflect on the text that we have constructed. In the case of education, we need to work with our colleagues to analyze the text we have constructed of our practices. To do this, Davies and her colleagues propose the development of a, quote, "kind of critical literacy," unquote, in which we come to better understand the discourses we draw upon to constitute ourselves, the discourses that constitute us, and the effects of these discourses as a means to bring about change. It is ironic that in a critical literacy project, we failed to apply a critical literacy lens to the texts we constructed. I believe that Foucault's work is useful for educators who wish to reconsider their teaching practice and align it more closely with the ways they wish to conduct themselves. Quote, "At every moment, step by step, one must confront what one is thinking and saying with what one is doing with what one is," unquote. Foucault encourages us to analyze our practices and the discourses that impact on our formation as thinking, speaking, and acting subjects. Thank you.